And so, do you remember the first record that you bought?
Yes, I think it was My Fair Lady, which was a big hit at the time. An LP with Stanley Holloway, Julie Andrews, and Rex Harrison. And I bought it in Mays, which was a great record shop, mainly for classical music, but they also allowed musicals and lighter music like that. And it was run by Mr. May, whose brother was a famous composer, Frederick May, and then Joan Smith, who then went on to be the librarian of RTE, a very knowledgeable lady in classical music particularly. So that, of course, the shop closed, I suppose, because the LPs were no longer being used so much, and CDs had come in and they didn't go into to that. And I think Mr. May died, and she got a good job in RTE. But it was a great mecca for people interested in classical music and in musicals and light operetta. That kind of music was very popular, and they always had a good selection. And if they didn't have it, they'd get it in. And they also sold EPs, the 45s, as well as the 33 and the thirds, which were the LPs for those who don't remember that era. So I then started to buy classical records. My father was very interested in classical music, and we often went to concerts of the RTE Orchestra, which were in the Gaiety Theatre or in the Francis Xavier Hall, and we met a lot of interesting musical figures over the years, and you then tried to buy their records, and you went to the RDS, and there were wonderful famous people like Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau and Victoria de Los Angeles, and major international figures. Arthur Rubinstein came to Dublin and so on. So we bought records, and then gradually, as I grew up, I bought more records, and then I was living in Belgium, and that was a great country to buy interesting records. And then in the Netherlands, and then in Paris, bought a lot of records there over the years too. This was in the 80s. There was a wonderful shop called Fnac, and they had a label called Irato very prominently in their shops, and you didn't get that in Ireland at all. So you got a very interesting variety of records over the years. And then I went to live in Saudi Arabia, but I didn't bring my records with me. At least only a select few, because the climate did not was not conducive to any vinyls of any description. But we had a lot of cassettes, and indeed a lot of bootleg cassettes came in, were sold quite openly in all the supermarkets, very handsomely copied from legitimate Deutsche Grammophon, EMI, Decca, all the big companies, but they were made, I think, mostly in Singapore or Malaysia, and sold very cheaply in Saudi. So we used to buy these all the time in Jeddah. It was a thing to do, going into the supermarket in the evenings. So that was a way of dealing with it. So between my record collection and my CDs, it certainly mounted up over the years.
Yeah. And how did you listen to music before records came in?
Well, we had a thing called the black box, which was a gramophone, and we had that at home, and it wasn't stereo, but there were two speakers, as far as I remember, within this one black box. So we always had a record player at home, and in fact my father had a very good collection of 78s, and they of course were breakable. They were made of shellac, I think it was called, and unfortunately they could break quite easily, so you had to be very careful with them. But he had all the Beethoven symphonies and Beethoven sonatas, and these would have been probably made in the 1930s and 40s, and then I think in the late 40s the LPs started to come in. But he certainly built up a collection. In fact, was a member of a thing called the Dublin Gramophone Circle, and they used to go to each other's houses and listen to records, favourite records, a bit like Desert Island Discs. You'd come along with your half a dozen favourite records and maybe play extracts. They were usually classical interest, so they would use those evenings for their musical education and musical interest. So it was always, as I say, on record players, and then eventually stereo came in. That was all very exciting. And then my brother, in fact, worked for a very fancy company called Lynn Sondek, based in Glasgow, and he subsequently bought and now owns a company called Arkham, and these are very high-flown CD and LP but also, of course, now the new technology, of which I know very little, even beyond the whole world of CDs, but they're into all of that, and the quality of sound and so on is extraordinary. But we have great affection still for the LPs.
Yeah.
They're very attractively produced, and it was always great fun seeing the latest ones coming in all the different fields, in the pop music as well. The Beatles covers were always very famous, the Stones, Horselips, the different Irish bands, Rory Gallagher, all these people, they had marvellous covers and very artistically done. And you don't really treat CDs in the same way at all, and the people who still have a record collection value it as much for the pleasure of taking the LP out and also reading a text in a script that you can actually read, as opposed to some tiny thing that's attached to a CD. So there's certain nostalgia for them, definitely, and in fact they seem to be coming back, and there are now record shops and people are looking back at their record players. In fact, you can of course buy a very good record player still at quite an expense, and luckily some people didn't throw them out and they've kept their CD collection and their LP collections.
Yeah. And did you prefer the sound of records to CDs? Because I know
I did, really, to be honest. And I suppose you also, I think you just took it more seriously because you had to put the record on in a way that the CD, went on for much longer. So you were kind of more involved with the process. But the sound certainly did seem to be particularly warm, and I'm not certain that the CD captured it quite so well, even though it's obviously extremely practical and very useful to have around. And let's face it, not everybody's house can take a huge collection of records, and I in fact gave my record collection to the Royal Irish Academy of Music for their library, because when I moved to a smaller house I'd run out of space. And this is, I'm sure, a consideration for a lot of people that weren't able to keep LPs, but certainly I think the sound from them, well, we certainly always felt it was better. It was one of those things that seemed to have reached a certain peak. Obviously listening to the old 78s, the sound could be fairly crackly in many cases, so that had advanced so much when the LP came into existence. But after that, I suppose now these new fangled things, of which I know little, and the cubes and so on, and the iPad and iPhones and whatever, they do have a good sound. But there's nothing like being in a room with speakers, rather than, I think, having something clamped on your head. I think there's a lot to be said for that sort of sense around. A bit like going to a concert, and quite frankly I think there's nothing better than going to a live concert or opera to see live musicians playing their hearts out for the public, and enjoying it with the public, such as we have at the National Concert Hall or the Gaiety Theatre or the new Gas Company Theatre, where they've recently done Tristan and Isolde of Wagner, which went on for 5 hours. But the theatre was so comfortable and people were so enthusiastic about the whole event that it was a real event in a great occasion, and that's hard to replicate if you're going around simply with little things stuck into your ears.
Yeah. And did you have was Maisie's your favourite record shop?
Yes, McCullough Piggott's was another very good record shop, and eventually HMV came, and then Tower Records came. But there was something about Mays, they always had a very interesting collection. In fact, the people who ran Mays now run a shop called Opus 2, which is in Georgia Street. And then, of course, there was the famous Waltons, which was more for Irish music, but they always had a great collection. And if you must sing a song, simply do sing an Irish song, or whatever, this radio programme that was on with Leo Maguire. So that was a great institution as well, in North Frederick Street. But Mays was the shop that people always went to first if you were looking for classical records. I think you would say. I don't know who was there before them, but certainly that was the one that I knew from the 60s on, in I suppose until the late 70s or something like that. It would have gone on. But it was always full of anoraks who liked going in to see their latest recordings, or to get Mays to order things and whatever. Then you went to London and you went to these huge stores, and you've got great things there as well. But it was nice to be able to support a local shop, and I'm sure there were some others. There was, I remember, one in Camden Street, and just up at South Richmond Hill, and that was a famous shop for both second hand and usually you had to be careful that they weren't scratched, but you could get very good records at good prices, and he had a very good collection of pop and jazz as well too, and he was very enthusiastic. I think the kind of people who go into this business usually are very driven and very specialised and are very acquainted with the whole world of recorded music in whatever field, you know.
Mm. And would you ever consider downloading music from the internet?
I haven't. I suppose because I go to a lot of concerts and I have a lot of CDs, many of which I bought and never listened to yet.
Yeah.
So I just haven't. I haven't. I'm not so into the internet. But no, I do sometimes, especially if I'm going to a performance, and sometimes for since I played the piano, I was asked to accompany the Austrian ambassador recently, and he wanted to sing songs by Fauré, a great 19th century French composer, and I didn't know these, but I was able to download them from the computer all right, and that I can do.
Yeah.
But beyond that, it's a very useful tool certainly, and there's a great deal of music and a lot of old performances. There's famous recordings of the Rosenkavalier with Elizabeth Schwarzkopf, and they have both extracts and very lengthy extracts indeed of that great opera, and recordings which were then filmed, and so we still have those, and they go back to the 1950s, and people used to go up to Terranure. There was the classic cinema up there, and they would show the operas. Now of course they're showing them, streaming them live from New York, so that's another great facility from the Metropolitan Opera, and many of the cinemas in Dublin are doing that when they're available. But certainly the internet is a terrific facility for people interested in music. But I don't know what the sound is like because I'm not listening to it for the sound, you know. But in the way that you did with records. But certainly it's a great facility to have, and there's so much on the computer now, isn't there?
Yeah.